Could we see an expansion pass for Pokémon Scarlet and Violet? With the Pokémon Present soon, this seems very likely, but what could this DLC look like? Or maybe we'll have new games altogether. Now, for a DLC, there are a couple rules it'll likely follow. First up, you should be able to get there quite early in the game, so you shouldn't need to mess with the final bosses to get to the DLC land. This is great for new players if they want action immediately. Then it's gonna be half of the main Pokemon game, not necessarily half the value, but half the price and a little bit less land. And it would make a lot of sense for them to have multiple waves, just to have more than one hype season. And yeah, it's very similar to Pokemon Sword and Shield's DLC, but that's what helped the game get over 20 million sales. So with all of that, where does this DLC take place? Let's compare the Paldea region to Spain, and if we zoom the map out a bit, we can see a few points of interest where this DLC could happen. To get there, we could climb this hill in the corner of Paldea. However, I'd say that would be considered a bit more of a late game area, so we can't pass through there. I can say for sure you won't get there swimming on the legendaries. Paldea will most likely be isolated from these other lands. I want to look at the ports. We could easily take a boat to get to these new lands. If we look at Levincia, that's fairly early on in the game, so technically you could get to the DLC immediately after visiting the trainer's school. I think Porto Morinda is less likely to be a gate to this DLC, because it's a little harder to get there than Levincia, but it's not impossible if they end up having a second wave of the DLC. Maybe the Levincia boat could bring you to Part 1, and this one could bring you to Part 2. Now, what exactly could happen on this other land? Well, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet weren't completely over. If we go to the school library and take a look at the Violet book, we're left with multiple unanswered questions. First, we have these two creatures. The first one seems to be a combination of the three Swords of Justice, and the second seems to be a paradox combination of the Johto trio. It has Suicune's crystal, and I think those are tails? It has Raikou feet, and then it has Entei's fangs. And the other paradox has Terrakions horns, its feet, it has Virizions petals, and Cobalions tail. So these legendaries could be part of Wave 1. I guess if we use Spain again, this hypothetical boat from Levincia could take us either up or to the right. The interesting thing about this is that if we go up, we have France and, well, Kalos. And they share the same land, so they could easily connect. While I really do want to go back to Kalos, I don't think it's gonna happen. If the DLC is half the price of Scarlet and Violet, there's no way they would remake an entire region. They might be able to sort of copy-paste the region, but they'd still have to reformat a lot of stuff because of the shorter characters. So this DLC will be emptier land with a town here and there. Kalos DLC is still possible, but I bet Pokemon would rather sell this on its own. Now for Wave 2, we have this very interesting creature, and for this story it could revolve around the Terastal phenomenon, because we didn't get a whole lot of closure on it. And this Pokemon could be the third legendary alongside Koraidon and Miraidon. In past Pokemon games, the third legendary would always be on top of the gimmick. In the Hoenn games, Rayquaza is the only Pokemon out of the legendaries that can Mega Evolve, and it doesn't even need a Mega Stone to do so. In Pokemon Ultra Sun and Moon, Necrozma can Ultra Burst instead of using a Z-move, and in Sword and Shield, you had Eternamax Eternatus, which took Dynamax to the next level. So in these games, the third legendaries sort of create an end to the gimmick. And yes, towards the end of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, your legendary does terastalize. But it was just a simple terastalization, there wasn't a lot to it, so this Pokemon must be the third legendary. Now for characters, it's gonna be all new characters, however there was one person who was sort of left hanging. If we read some of the books in the research station, we know that Professor Sada and Turo were together at some point. However, while the main professor is gone, the other one is probably out there somewhere. Maybe they went to this DLC area to pursue some research on the legendaries. Next, for another DLC option, we could have past or future DLC, which would involve time travel. So basically there wouldn't be any new locations, it would just be the same map, maybe a little bit scaled down, but with plenty of Paradox Pokemon. Unfortunately, there's no way Game Freak is making 50 or more Paradox Pokemon to fill up this world. But remember, in Area Zero, even if they have past and future forms, they also have regular Pokemon, so it's still doable. Now our last option is completely new games, so some sort of Pokemon Ultra Scarlet and Ultra Violet. I'm really hoping this doesn't happen because third versions, while they can be quite cool sometimes, can be a bit lazy. And these would be basically a modified Pokemon Scarlet and Violet with an extremely altered ending. Instead of the professor having a Koraidon or Miraidon, he could summon this thing. then Suicune or Virizion could be some sort of post-game. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening.